Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our next episode of our video series, Cut It Out COVID, where we always strive to give you the most data-driven, to-the-point information without any of the media spin and other hoopla that happens out there that unfortunately we deal with in the United States all too often over the past year. And we're going to talk about a few key updates in our fifth video over here, recorded today, May 24th, 2021. And to really talk about how we really are continuing on an excellent path in the United States as far as our progress against fully stabilizing the coronavirus situation, like we've talked about in past videos, and definitely check them out if you want a little bit of a refresher, etc., about some of the details that we really dove into in much more depth. But we really have been on a good path for quite a number of months now, between the research efforts in the U.S., the vaccine efforts, the development, et cetera, as well as the overall understanding about who's at high risk and who are the vast majority that are very low risk of complications from COVID, where the vast majority have a risk of getting severe COVID that's far, far, far less than 1%, roughly about 1 in 100,000 or less. So, quite low rates for the vast majority, thankfully. And so the key topics we're going to talk about today are going to be just an update about the vaccine efficacy and how far we've come as far as population immunity, aka herd immunity, and touching on that topic. And where we really are, part of the punchline is that we really probably are essentially at a herd immunity right now, and we'll explain shortly as well. Secondly is about the so-called variants that are circulating. Now, variants are normal biological changes in viruses because the virus lifespan is short. So you see these kind of evolutionary changes very much more rapidly in a short period of time. So this is very normal, which is why the flu vaccine strain, the flu strain changes every year, et cetera. So the variants, which have been hyped up big time in the media, to the point where it's laughable. But we'll talk about how, fortunately, that does not seem to pose any kind of significant risk or difference in the path here. And actually, the vaccines, and we'll show you the data that shows exactly that. The most common vaccines in the United States, the Pfizer-BioNTech one, for example, is highly efficacious against the variants that are in circulation. And we'll talk about that in detail. And then some other last few issues about things like travel, vaccine passports, and all that kind of stuff. So to kick off, first of all, let's talk about how successfully the vaccine drive has ramped up population immunity very rapidly, such that we now have, conservatively, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of people have some degree of immunity in their body, either via natural infection or via vaccine-induced antibody titer generation, and therefore roughly about 70% of people in the United States across the board have some degree of immunity among the adult population that has been vaccinated and even in general. So, and then what's happened over the past 4.5 months is that we've gone from less than 10% of people, 7-8% of people having immunity, because the number of infections that total after all of everything last year was less than 10% of the country. So, 330 million people, and roughly about 27, 28 million people last year officially had a positive COVID test. And these were not necessarily all distinct, people. Some might have been multiple tests. And I know patients who've gotten tested multiple times, not by me, of course, but, who've gone through multiple tests. So, but say, just for argument's sake, roughly 28 million people still is less than 10% of the U.S. population. And that is of relevance in terms of talking about things like population immunity and herd immunity. So by so many people, such a fraction of people, a high fraction of people in the country having immunity, what happens is the vaccine, somebody might be exposed to the virus, but they will not develop an actual infection nor a clinical infection, fevers and cough and shortness of breath, etc. So that is huge, right? I mean, so, one might be exposed to coronavirus. Somebody has coronavirus, they cough in your face or something of that nature happens. They're breathing on you for several minutes in like conversation, for example. But because of your pre-existing immunity that you've acquired from either natural infection or by vaccine receipt, so with either way, your immune system has pre-existing immunity to ward off clinical infection. If the virus enters any cell, it waves a flag, so to speak, by analogy in the immune system that says, hey, there's something wrong here. There's an abnormal protein, virus in my body, in the cell. Please come take care of it to the immune system. Then the immune system comes in, the antibodies do their thing, and they kill off those cells that may harbor a pathogen like SARS-CoV-2. So therefore, the chain of transmission is being very, very successfully broken. So in fact, we can see this because the number of tests that are returning positive, so the percent positive test rate has dropped dramatically since the recent peak, which is not the overall peak, was back in last spring in 2020. But the recent peak, which was roughly January 7th, January 8th, the first week of January of 2021, went from about 13.7, 13.9% of tests returning positive for, positive tests for coronavirus, which doesn't necessarily imply clinical infection, of course, but they were positive tests for it. And now it's dropped to less than 3% over the past few days as of May 24, 2021. So let me show you the actual curves from the Johns Hopkins website, which is tracking this, and we'll show you this right now. And you guys should be able to see my the screen right now. This is from the Johns Hopkins website live right now, the Coronavirus Resource Center that they have. So this is a daily state-by-state trends, and the blue curve here is the percentage of tests that are positive. And like I mentioned, roughly around January 7th, January 8th, it is 13.6, 13.78%, and you can see 13.9 was, I believe, the peak percent. And now, let me move the mouse away. You can look how dramatically over the last few months the curve has dropped. And the big change, obviously, is the number of people having population having immunity, via vaccine receipts. So, because the only thing that can so rapidly achieve that much, pre-existing immunity in people is by something like a vaccine drive, because you're not going to suddenly get that many people infected, especially in a big country like the U.S. in terms of population. So look at how much has trended down, and then the last few days you can see, I'm just going to trace my mouse, you can see it in the blue boxes, 2.6, 2.7%. So really, fantastic, that we have reached this point that people are, having this many few tests, even though we're still testing a good number. So remember, back in the fall, the total tests went up as the number of the total positive tests went up as the number of total tests conducted went up. That was largely the relationship as shown in that Johns Hopkins graph over the last year plus. But now we continue to do a significant number of tests every day, and it might be a little bit hard to see with there, these orange bars. So we still test, over 1 million. If you look at the top number here, total tests, 1,430,561, for example, right? So it's a little bit less than before because fewer symptomatic people, but you can still see we're hitting 1 million tests pretty consistently. Just last week, 1,365,000 tests done, and 28,000 were positive, which is only 2.7%. So that just shows the significant impact of that pre-existing immunity breaking the chain of transmission, and that's why the number of tests in the United States, the number of positive cases in the United States has dropped dramatically, less than 10% of the total positive test numbers back in the end of December, beginning of January. Now, remember, as a little bit of a frame of reference for that specific date, it's very interesting. The January 7th, 8th, that first week of January date is interesting because that is the first week where people could have received the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine, because that was the first one authorized by the FDA for emergency use. So a lot of healthcare professionals like myself, we received the Pfizer vaccine in that very first week, especially as an oncologist, where we're dealing with immunocompromised elderly patients who are obviously at high risk. So, doing it for the patients that I see that are obviously at very high risk because of their immune system compromised, etc. But, nevertheless, the point is that that second dose would have been received that first week of January. So it was fascinating that is the point where you see that boom, that super, decrease in the curve. So that's number one. Secondly is how many people have received the vaccine. And this is where we talk about touching now on next topic on population immunity. And let me segue back to my internet browser. And this is the official numbers from the CDC as far as how many people have received at least one dose of the vaccine. So remember that with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, especially the Pfizer one, from the data we reviewed in a previous video, the even one dose of the vaccine, the first dose of the vaccine, once you're past 14 days after receiving that first dose, there's roughly an 83 to 84% efficacy rate at preventing serious cases of infection. So therefore, somebody might get an infection, but it's going to be a mild outpatient kind of infection. You either may be asymptomatic or you may have only, some fevers and cough and fatigue and so forth, but it'll resolve on its own after a few days, as opposed to severe infection, so-called, where somebody may have a hospitalization case, etc. So the 83% for one dose, 95% for two doses was the data from the Pfizer and Moderna trials approximately. And you can see over here, importantly, population greater than or equal to 18 years of age. You can hopefully see my mouse cursor circling that. 158 million Americans have gotten at least one dose, so which is 61% of the adult population. And this is just for vaccine. So 158 million, therefore, have at least an 83% protection rate, so to speak, against severe COVID. And among the 65 plus age group, which is the much higher risk group, it's 85% of people in the country that are 65 plus that have it. So ideally, you want to protect the high risk individuals, right? So that's why that is such a huge thing. So 61% of the adult population in the U.S. has received at least one dose. Therefore, have at least 83%, if not, some significant fraction of those have two doses already. So already 30 million or so have had two doses. So they have somewhere between 83 to 95% effectiveness in their immune system via receipt of the vaccination. Now, add in terms of the overall population immunity, it's the vaccine recipients plus natural immunity people. And there is some overlap in these numbers, but just for argument's sake, conservatively, there have been about 33 million Americans that have been diagnosed with a positive coronavirus test over the past year and year and a quarter, and another 163 million, like I talked about just now, 158 million, excuse me, have had the vaccine, at least one dose. So therefore, when you add them up, conservatively, you're somewhere around 190 million people that have had either natural infection, natural exposure to the virus, and therefore generating immunity naturally in the immune system versus people who got the vaccine. So by those two numbers being added up, it translates in the adult population to somewhere north of 70% that have some degree of immunity, 83, 95%, somewhere in that ballpark. So, a lot of people hypothesize, well, what's the real number we need? I've been asked that question innumerable times over the past, several months. And, nobody really knows. I mean, that's the truth also, is that nobody really knows, because these kind of population immunity studies, herd immunity kind of studies, were always done, excuse me, in small populations, 20 people, 50 people, 100 people, not like 330 million people in a country. That's has not been studied, rigorously in that way. But conservatively, people think that, okay, well, it's got to be at least 60, 70% of people are needed to have some immunity before you can say we have herd immunity. So herd immunity doesn't mean that nobody can get, a serious infection. Obviously, unfortunately, it can happen, but the number of people that have it is so low that, like, our big message over the last several months has been, we can successfully go about our day-to-day life, our day-to-day business, vacations, all that kind of stuff very comfortably because of how successful we've been in the U.S. over the past, 6+ months in terms of stabilizing this, So via the knowledge side, the vaccine side, etc. So that's why it's huge that we've reached that kind of number. So 70+%, conservatively, most of us would say that we're probably at, whether you officially say herd immunity or pretty close to it. But I would argue really that we're either at herd immunity or really close to it, one way or another, and that's why the infection rates are really low. So for example, at the major tertiary, hospital center where I, am affiliated with, the number of people that have active COVID that are actually inpatients right now, we have like a live dashboard to track, how many are tested, how many are admitted, how many are on ventilators, all that kind of stuff. The number last Monday was less than 30. In the whole hospital, in a 900+ bed hospital. So it's again, it's not to say that there can't be a few serious cases out there, because we know elderly, immunocompromised, serious lung diseases, asthma, COPD, emphysema, etc., significant cardiovascular disease, etc., obesity. These are the big five kind of conditions. So when people have these things, there is going to be some people who have serious infections, serious complications, just like happens with any infection, of a lot of infections, right? I mean, pneumonia cases every winter and flu cases every winter. I mean, there's always a few, sadly, that have serious cases, but across the board, it's such a low number that we should not be panicking. We can live our lives. We don't need to panic about it. If it's less than 30 people that get admitted from COVID in a major, regional hospital, hey, we can handle that. Doctors can handle that. So that's we're trained to do that. We have enough manpower. 30 is not going to overwhelm the medical system. In a given hospital, especially when this is like any major hospital. If you're having low number, and there might be pockets here and there in the country, obviously, that may have more, may have less. I mean, it's going to be heterogeneous, right? It's not going to be the same number everywhere. But very, very good news, clearly, in my view. Now let's segue to the second of our two topics, which is the variance among the viruses. So it's normal that under biological pressure, it's like an evolutionary kind of process. The viruses mutate. And those mutations that are induced are normal in calling them variants. But it's like analogous to saying, your child has a slightly different, it'll be similar, but not the same DNA as you, right? I mean, it's like you plus your spouse, and it's a combination of the DNA, obviously, a little different than what viruses do, of course, in terms of that replication, but in terms of the DNA mixture that you get from, a man and a woman, and all that kind of stuff. So, but needless to say, it's kind of like saying, well, my child's height is a little bit different than my height, even if it's a son and a dad, but that being said, we don't say, oh, it's a variant. It's like there are these gene mutations, obviously, and gene changes generation to generation. But that's really what happens fundamentally with all biological organisms, whether you talk about complex, humans and mammals, or something, very small and simple like a virus. So it's normal. So there's a number of variants, and like we talked in the past, even the most common virus that's in the U.S. now is already, this is the second time it's different. There was the original virus from China, from Wuhan. Then there was a different variant that took place in the U.S. last year. Curiously, it didn't get any press about it, not much press about it, maybe because the media didn't, get tipped off that there was a variant out there. And then the UK variant is now the most common variant in the U.S. B.1.1.7 is like the biological name they give it. They give these weird numbers and letters to them as part of the nomenclature. So now the UK variant is the most common variant. That's the dominant strain in the United States, and this is normal. It's normal for the virus to change. It's not going to be the same virus. I mean, we don't have the same flu virus, for the last 50 years, right? I mean, it would sound silly for anybody to even suggest that it's the same thing. So anyway, so it's very normal. The critical thing is we are not at somehow more danger or more risk. I mean, not that there can't be some random mutation that could confer more risk. It's not impossible, but not materially. Overall, the situation is very stable. And importantly, one of the key data sets is, well, I mean, look at the big picture in the U.S. Look at those graphs we just showed from Johns Hopkins, right? So in spite of now having like a third dominant strain, the UK strain currently, the rates are still way, 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 way down, right? So that's number one. Secondly, there have been two recent publications, research efforts, research publication efforts that have looked at the data against a few key variants. So the UK variant, another variant that's more prominent in the Middle East and so forth, and thirdly, the so-called Indian variant, in India, that's we're also going to show you the data for. So against all of these, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is highly efficacious, where to prevent symptomatic and severe COVID, it's 90 to 100% effectiveness. So let me show you that data right now. And again, the purpose being, let's try to allay some fears here. Okay, so here is one page. It's a New England Journal of Medicine publication. So real-world data against these two variants, B.1.1.7, which is a UK variant, and the B.1.351 variant, which is a different one. And this was data from Qatar, but using the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine over here. You can see me circling with my mouse cursor. And let me cut to the punchline here, which showed that those who got were at least 14 days after the second dose. So when they say after one dose, they mean like between dose 1 and dose 2, which is like 3 weeks. So at least 14 days after the second dose, and therefore the immune system has sufficient time to build up, generate antibodies and so forth. The effectiveness is highly successful. So you can see PCR confirmed infection. This is just PCR positivity. After 14 days after a second dose with B.1.1.7 is 89.5%. For the B.1.351, it's 75%. That's just for PCR positivity, which is, again, not like a big deal is not PCR positivity. We just want to prevent severe infection. People that get mild infection or asymptomatic infection, it's that kind of stuff happens. We have a million pathogens out there where people get mild coughs and colds, right? Now, look at this one, severe, critical, or fatal. So this is really what we care about from a medical perspective. B.1.1.7 and B.1.351. In the Qatar data, 100% effectiveness by the Pfizer-BioNTech if you're at least 14 days after the second dose, and 100% effectiveness, again, B.1.351. Overall, 97.4% for any strain that was observed in this data set. So, hopefully very reassuring that the efficacy is quite strong against those two, right? Now, the third one is the India one. And the India situation is very different because of, less than 10% of people there have gotten any vaccine. First of all, and secondly, they don't have like vaccines that are as effective as the ones in the United States. So a lot of them are like, there's some local vaccines, there's the Russia Sputnik one, there's one from China. So very different vaccine efficacy rates, what they're getting compared to what we're getting. So, and that's relevant because the herd immunity that we have, like I mentioned earlier, I believe we have it, is that we not only have herd immunity, but we have a highly effective herd immunity because we have vaccine receipt across the country with a medication vaccine that is 83% to 95% effective against preventing serious COVID infection. So it's not only herd immunity in terms of the population having some immunity, but it's a highly effective immunity also. So that's a big deal. So let me show you the data that was from a UK group against the Indian variant, which is called B.1.617.2. And there's two of them, B.1.617.1 and 0.2. So, these two. And basically what they found, and I'll cut to the punchline here as well. So after 2 doses of the vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, for example, the rate of preventing serious infection with the B.1.617 one is, and I'll circle it, 87.9%. So 87.9% success in this study defined as preventing symptomatic infection. So with the B.1.1.7, it's always like a tongue twister, these random numbers, but it was 93.4% in this UK study and 87.9% against B.1.617.2. So meaning that even against the Indian variant, the vaccine works and works quite well. And that's their endpoint in that study was preventing symptomatic infection. And, practically, again, we care about just preventing infection that's serious, the hospitalization level infection or, something like a fatal infection. So if we're preventing that, if we reach a point where a very low number, less than 1%, are getting, a serious infection that requires hospitalization or worse, somebody dying from it, then, we're really in business. I mean, I think we're in business now, but we're really, really in business at that point because the numbers are so low that, people can truly, say we're past it. So the last section we'll talk about here will be with just the last couple points is about things like a right to refusal. So there are going to be some people who decline the vaccine. And really, it's not the end of the world. I do encourage it, at least for the high risk groups and the high exposure groups. So people that see a lot of customers, whether it's doctors, nurses, but even people in stores where you're encountering people all the time. I have a few patients who are flight attendants, and I tell them, look, you're going to encounter literally hundreds of people that you have no idea who the heck they are, and they're going to be passing you in close quarters. So these are the kind of people. You have high exposure. You might be a healthy individual. Your risk of getting severe COVID is very low, but obviously, that is one reason to consider, getting it. And then, of course, the high risk groups, clearly, like the elderly people and so forth as well. So it's great to see that the number of people that are in the 65 plus age group are over 80% that have received at least one dose of the vaccine. So that's fantastic. So at least if you protect the high risk people, then the people that are going to get serious complications goes way, 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 way down. And therefore, we're in pretty good position as a society. So that's number one. I think it is a discussion. I mean, there's no medical product that I would ever argue should everybody has to get it. I mean, it's absurd to think that. So this kind of like shaming out there, that I hear sometimes, like, oh, how can you not get it? You're crazy and this and that. I'm like, look, people have their reasons. I have some patients who have had very bad vaccine experiences in the past because of their personal history, and you respect that. Everybody's different. I mean, you can't. I think as long as enough people get it, which thankfully we have, then we reach that population immunity level, which is important as a society in terms of the overall medical strategy here. And secondly, those that are either concerned or you're at high exposure, like I mentioned, some of these customer-facing industries, then also reasons to consider getting it. And thankfully now we have over 150 million doses of information, so the risk of having some kind of bad side effect appears to be quite low, and the side effects that do happen are overwhelmingly just transient. A few days you may not feel so hot, but it goes away. A lot of these are inflammation and immune system stimulation symptoms, which are normal for a vaccine. So with that, I think that things like everybody has to get the vaccine kind of ideas and vaccine passports, I mean, I think really don't hold water from a medical perspective. That's just my perspective about that based on the overall putting it all together over here. But thankfully, the vaccines are highly effective against these so-called variants, which are again part of the fear propagation by the media, trying to look for a new story to talk about. But like we talked about, it doesn't hold water medically either. And secondly is that thankfully, the rates of the percent positive test rates have dropped exceedingly dramatically over the last 4 months, thanks to rapid ramp of population immunity. So we're really right on track, just like we were 6 months ago, like we talked about extensively in previous videos. So that's the big update today. We will definitely give you further updates as every time there's something relevant to report and discuss. But I think hopefully some good data for you guys to enjoy and digest. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that and appreciate that. And talk to you guys soon. And have a great one. Have a great summer coming up. Weather's heating up. And we will see you guys very soon. Thanks a lot. Good luck.